Hi, you may have come across the OpenEXR format. It's a type of HDR format that was developed by Industrial Light and Magic, actually, and it is a very useful format, but can be confusing to use at first. So maybe you rendered an image from a 3D animation program, or you just saw it listed there. And even if you tried it, you may have had some results where you couldn't view the image the way you wanted to, but it can help solve some problems. You also may have rendered a PNG or something and gotten a darker image than you expected when you saw it in your program. There's all sorts of color management issues with these different file formats, but OpenEXR saves a tremendous amount of information about your image, and that makes it very useful for dealing with issues like this. However, you need to have some software to take advantage of this, and software can be expensive. Yep, Photoshop can do this, but not everyone has access to Photoshop, so I wanted to introduce some free ways of dealing with the OpenEXR format. I'm Aaron, this is Aaron Tinkers, so let's tinker with OpenEXR. Let's take a look at this page for OpenEXR. It can help explain what it's all about, but it's actually kind of a bland page, so you could take a look at that if you'd like. But what I'm going to do is open up a file, actually first on a Mac. And the reason I'm going to start on a Mac is because the Preview app, believe it or not, does a great job of working with this. It's not going to be perfect for every situation. However, it is free, it's on everybody's Mac, and it does a good job, and it helps introduce us to some great things you can do with OpenEXR. So looking at these pictures in the Finder here, I picked them on purpose, and let me just explain what's going on. So first of all, what I was explaining before, where sometimes you'll export an image from another program and get a PNG that comes out darker than you expected. For instance, these were created in Maya, and when I first created them, I ended up with these sort of darker image that I was not expecting. And what I did was I exported as .exr instead, and what you may notice here on the Mac is that it shows pretty well. It is a little bit washed out looking. On a Windows machine, you may see nothing. In other words, a .exr file is not really previewed very well there, so it'll just have an icon. And the built-in programs don't seem to know what to do with a .exr file. So this is why we're starting on the Mac and with a preview, and also because the tools there are pretty visual and they help us understand what's going on, and you can see the other options. But I will be showing Windows options that are free and pretty easy to use. Let's start with the most dramatic one here. I'm going to open this snapshot2.exr. I just double-clicked on it. Preview is the default app for doing this sort of thing. We have this relatively dark image, and I would like that to be a bit brighter. Most of the detail seems to be in darkness. In other words, there's not a lot of bright spots on it at all. What you might not realize is that there's a bunch of color information in the dark shadows, in the lights, and you may have heard of this before with HDR. That's the purpose of high dynamic range imagery, is that there's a lot more detail in the lighter spaces and the darker spaces. And if we want to convert this into an image we can share and take advantage of that, we have the tools to do so. So when I go to Tools and I choose Adjust Color, you'll see this little helper window pop up, and it has this thing called a histogram up on top. And even though it's kind of hard to see it, it's trying to show us the places where greens and blues have all the color information. And you'll notice the potential space that we have to go much higher out to the right-hand side to get much brighter, but none of this information is actually in that space. So one of the things you can do with a level adjuster like this is simply you can move this middle bar over to adjust everything, and sort of you'll see it kind of squish out towards the middle. And when I do this, I'm kind of taking the middle area of all the color and stretching it out. But if I really want to brighten up these areas, I need to take where the highest brightness is and move it towards the colors that are in that space. So as I get to this end, you'll see those brighter spots get very bright. Now, when you get too far, you'll begin to actually lose information. That means that certain spaces will be blown out, and that's one of the purposes of the histogram. You can see areas that you're losing as you cut them off from one edge or the other. So this is way, way brighter, and I like that. You can get similar effects with exposure. I'll show you that on the next image. Once you've made your corrections, of course, you're going to want to export this in a different format. So we're going to want to go to File and choose Export. And if you are really just going to share it on the web, the main formats you're looking for are going to be either JPEG, or you can go down to PNG. And you want to kind of keep the depth up if you can. The alpha channel, what that means is maintaining transparency. In both of these images, I had no objects behind them in the 3D rendering, so they left that actually transparent, which can be very useful if you want to merge this with other images or put it in a place where the background you want it to show through in certain areas. But it can be a bit of a pain if you didn't mean for it to be there. So you might want to do some image editing with it, and you can overlay it on top of a dark background. I do want to mention one more option here, which is TIFF. So TIFF is a very well supported format, and you'll notice one of the benefits here is that it has what's called 32 bits per channel. And what that basically means is you have much more color information in each channel, which we're talking about the red, the green, and the blue channels. So it just means you lose less information. So if you really want to keep everything intact the way you've managed the colors but put it into a different format, you could use TIFF. But I'm just going to go to PNG, and I'm going to hit, let's give it a different name. I'll call this Export, and I'll just hit Save. One of the things that I did here was I made a lot of changes to this .exr file, and I really don't want to do that. I want to keep things sort of intact. I don't want to save any changes. And one thing you got to be careful of with Preview is that it essentially keeps the changes that you make without you having to save, which can be good, but if you're trying to maintain your file, it's important to kind of go back to where you were. I could have done reset all on here as well. So I'm just going to close, and you can see my new image, how much brighter that is, and how that'll be much more useful for sharing on a web page or something like that. So now I want to look at this logo I have here. You can go to exposure instead, kind of bring things up, and you can watch the whole histogram change that way. And you can do things like make the shadows, make the contrast go up. It gives you a similar idea than messing with the levels. But yeah, that works pretty well to punch things up. All right, let's quit Preview and look at some of the free options that you can get when you're on Windows. First things first, I'll show a web option. And there's a couple of these. There is the A-Convert option, which is full of ads, and it converts formats, but it doesn't give you a lot of control over what the image is going to look like. So I'll show you this OpenHDR viewer. And this web page, I'll put the link in the description, but it's viewer.openhdr.org. And on this page, you can see, it's very small there, but you can see that the formats it supports are EXR and Radiance HDR. So these are going to give you a similar options that we had a minute ago, but there are some limitations to this. So I'm just going to click on the icon here and I'm able to choose my file. I'm going to choose this same snapshot. And you'll notice that right away, it understands where the information is and kind of focuses on that. And we got a lighter image to begin with. That's very nice. And we have some options here. So if I stick with the exposure, I can use my scroll wheel to kind of go up and down, and I can decide where the area of my image is going to be. And that works pretty well. So if you just need to do like a quick change here, you can do this. You can try the exposure and just maybe get things up to where you want it to be. Keep in mind, again, they're trying to show you where you might be cutting information off on either end. Now I'm going to go to the other options. There's a gamma option, which has 2 areas to change, and they're very sensitive. But this can give you come up from the dark side of the image and bring them up, but then also take the lighter side of it and kind of adjust the gamma. Works pretty well. This is pretty handy, pretty useful. So once you finish with that, you can simply go to this little grid down on the bottom with tools, and there are options to save as a PNG and to save as a JPEG. So I'm going to click on Save PNG, and it downloaded into my Downloads folder. I'm just going to drag that up into my file here, and our folder, and you can see that I got a good result from that, and I'm able to now share that on the web. Works pretty well. One benefit here is actually that the alpha channel it sort of ignores and gives me a black in place of it, which can be handy if that's the look you're going for. Okay, now I'm going to switch to another program. This is Affinity Photo. This is not free. Right now it happens to be 50% off, which makes it about $25. It is a full-featured sort of photo editing, image editing program. And I recommend if you are going to pay something, go for this one. Works great on Windows, works great on Mac. It is really nice. The company's at a good place. They're doing well, so it should be updating well for a while. There's a lot of cheap image editing programs out there, and they come with a lot of drawbacks. And I think if you can really pay only $25 for something like this, that's what you want to do. But let me show you the go-to free option, which has its drawbacks, but is very powerful, and that is GIMP. So GIMP is an open source project that has gone back for, I think, decades now. And it is basically trying to be like Photoshop and is made to be open source and run on different platforms, but was originally made for Linux platforms. So there's some drawbacks to that in the sense that, for instance, on Windows, you're going to have to install and this happens automatically, but you have to install, I think it's called GTK, the support for the interface, which makes the install size pretty big. It ends up being about 1 gigabyte on Windows. It's about half that on the Mac. But the benefit of using something like this, and let me switch to it, is that it's a full-featured image editor. So yes, you can control the colors, but also you get to work with layers and put that background in if you need to, for instance. Let's open a file. I'm going to use this dark file, the .exr file. And this is our typical sort of layout for an image editor. You'll notice that there's layers over on the side. That's going to be an advantage in a minute. But first, let's show the color options and the way we can change the levels. It's up here in the colors menu. We could use exposure. There's a couple different approaches you could take to this. I'm going to go to levels, which should look pretty familiar now. And you'll see the color space on here. There's a couple of options up here you can play with, like there's linear and visually, perceptually they call it. Either way, I can still use that same little triangle on the right to bring it in, and we get a pretty good result there. You'll notice that this automatically finds its center in a different place. We can still move that, but it does move it along, and I actually like that feature. Gives you a pretty good result pretty quickly, so I'm pretty happy with that right there. We've kind of crunched where the maximum high brightness is and where the darks are, and you can see this little edge here where I can just tighten that in, and you can see this is kind of a full-fledged image editing program, and it had some nice features like that one where it looks at my perceptual light. I have a little bit more space to work with on the dark end here than I did in preview. So that's really, really nice. I like the contrast. I like how that image came out, and I'm ready to save it. And you're going to have similar export options, but I'm going to press OK first. And you'll notice these areas here. The image editor is showing me these little checkerboards to show that that's actually a transparent part of the image. Sometimes it's called an alpha section. There's basically empty space in these areas, which again can be good when you want to overlap and composite with other images. But if I want this to be actually black, I'm going to do that real quick. Nothing fancy here. This is just a typical image editor stuff, but I'm going to add a layer. And I said nothing fancy, but GIMP likes to give me all the options in the universe for this. I'm just going to go with the defaults though. And I'll notice that the layer is over this image, so I'm going to drag it down below. And I'm just going to use the paint bucket, if I can find it in this mess up here. There we go. I'm going to click on the paint bucket. I'm really just looking for it to be black. It's a foreground. It's already black. So if I just click into the layer, I have this bottom layer selected that's empty. If I click in there, now it's black. So this is one of the advantages, right? I have an image editor and I can make alterations to it, and I'm feeling pretty good about this image, so I'm ready to export. And I'm going to do export as. I definitely don't want it to be a .exr. In this program, you can get new options just by typing in the extension that you want. Yep, as soon as I hit export, I get these extra options, and there are many of them. And at this point, I'm going to go with the defaults. Looks pretty good. I'm going to do export. And we should see in the image will look very similar to this when I export it now, because it's in a regular sort of color space. So that's good news. That's one more program. I have one more to go. Blender. Okay, so Blender is a full 3D animation program, and it might seem like overkill, but it's actually about the same size as GIMP on the Mac anyway, but on Windows it's smaller than the GIMP program because of all the extra stuff that gets installed with it. So it ends up being a decent option, and there is a nice benefit to Blender as well. So let me explain. First, let's go over to Blender. The reason Blender works so well is because it has a video editing section interface with it, and this is great because we'll be able to use not only the .exr as a single image, but if we had an image sequence, we can do all the same things I'm about to do to one image to an entire sequence. So this gives us a lot more flexibility when you're animating something and giving out image sequences. So let's do this on one image, though. I'll show you how to do the color correction. I have another video that deals with how to use Blender as a way to create a video file from image sequences. But now let's just do the color correction. For color correction, we will click on the video editing option here when we first open Blender. The first time you actually open Blender, you may have a couple other options. You can just go with the defaults, but when this screen comes up, you're going to want to choose video editing. Completely changes what the interface looks like. And we're going to try to keep it simple and not dive into all this video editing stuff. We're in this sequence area. We're going to find a menu called Add, and I would like to add the image sequence. Really, I'm just going to add one image here, but it'll work. And I'm going to choose that option again, the .exr, snapshot 2 here. And we'll see our dark, strangely shaped blocks again. So one of the things to look out for is the size of your image. If it's different than the default here, which is 1920 by 1080, you'll end up with something stretched or squished, and you can just make the adjustments here to match that up to your original image's size. To adjust the color, if you look on the right-hand side of the sequencer, we will see that this looks pretty good. It says adjust, and it has color. It has some options here, and it might seem like this is what you want, but this isn't really what we want. Right below the strip tab, which is what we're looking at here for this pane, there is a modifiers tab. We're going to click on that, and we're going to add some modifiers. And here's where we get to actually make the changes we're looking for. Let's add color balance. So I'm going to go to color balance, and this gives you some options for actually changing the literal color balance, switching between different colors from what you have, which is useful, but not what we're looking for. And I'll let you know, I'll let you see here that if you just wanted to bring some gain to this and make it brighter, this little option works pretty well. You can bring it up a little, and you can see the change. Then there's also the overall gamma that can bring up the shadows as well. There's this thing called lift, which brings everything up. It's pretty dramatic. Might be a little much. So that can get us partway there, but there's something missing here, and that is that histogram that we had before. So I'll just show you a way to bring something like that in. We're going to go up to the video editing sort of view, and I'm going to click on the view menu, and you'll see an option way at the bottom called area. We're going to do vertical split. Make it about halfway. See this little line that appeared? I'm going to move it back and forth where I want it. I'm just going to click. Now I've got two views of the same thing, but we can change what we're looking at here. So this right here is the display mode. And the display mode gives me some options, including a histogram right there. So we can get that histogram that we were looking at before. And as I make these adjustments, we can now more clearly see kind of what goes off the edges. So if I was to make my, let's go back to the gain for a minute. Watch the effect of the histogram, how it crunches the colors. And what this helps you do is give an idea of how far you should go without losing information. these little tiny vertical lines, little tiny white lines on the edges are showing me kind of my limits. If I was to go past them, I would lose that. Now gain stays within those bounds, which is nice. Gamma changes what the balance is, right, between the dark and the light. And then if I go to the top and we look at the lift, it's really going to dramatically crunch things, and you can see how it cuts off that bottom edge. You can see everything's moved up against way above the black line, and we have everything is gray essentially that lands in this area. So that's why that one is really so dramatic. There are other tools here that you could use, strip modifiers here, and I'll let you experiment with those, but basically the idea of being able to have the histogram here and use these will get you a very similar result. And again, the advantage to using Blender, besides the fact that it is also open source and also free and also a smaller download than even GIMP on Windows, you'll end up with the ability to do video, right? So you'll have an image sequence in here and you can affect these types of changes to the entire video all at once. So great benefit to that. So just to recap real quick, the OpenEXR format is really useful because it contains so much color space. There's actually quite a bit more to it than that. It can be layered. It has all sorts of things you can put together. Again, it was developed by Industrial Light and Magic, so it has a lot of utility for effects. But if you're going to use it, we need some free software for that. We can use expensive software if we want, but if you want to get the free options, remember we mentioned that there was this web page here, viewer.openhdr.org, where you can upload things, do some quick changes, which are relatively limited, but you can get good results quickly, and then download a PNG as a result. We had the ability to use Preview on the Mac. If you had it, it gets you pretty much all the way, and it's just a free, simple app for previewing pictures. Then we talked about GIMP, which was a bit of a heavy download, but a full image editing program with plenty of options like adding layers and backgrounds. And then we talked about the paid option of Affinity Photo, which is pretty cheap overall and gives you many of the features that Photoshop will give you. And then we talked about Blender, and Blender gives you the ability to do image sequences, which gives you the ability to change the color space for an entire video. And I should add with Blender that you could also add extra layers underneath and get some of the similar compositing effects that you would have had from GIMP as well. Pretty much it, folks. Lots of free options for working with this format that gives you a lot more flexibility than the other formats. And it can be a little weird to work with at first, but I think it gives you ultimately a lot more control over your images and how you share them and what you want them to look like. So I hope this little dive into some of that complexity will get you started. There's quite a bit of an art to this. With experience and practice, everyone can get some good results. I hope that helps, and I'll see you later.